ahead of him. And he also orders them to form black regiments when he encountered enough former slaves. Now, he didn't do this. Sherman was not in favor of African American soldiers. He was everybody at this point was somewhat racist, but Sherman was more racist than average. He just didn't think that blacks could fight, so he didn't do that, to his detriment. But Sherman says he's going to move through Georgia, smashing things to the sea. He said, I can make the march and I can make Georgia howl. And he wanted to not only damage the South's capacity to make war, but also to inflict psychological damage. And that's very important. He's not just trying to destroy the Confederacy's ability to feed itself and to equip itself, but also to demoralize them so much, to make it to where they just think resistance is futile and just give up. All right, so there's a psychological element that's creeping into it as well. In early November, Sherman orders all civilians out of Atlanta, and then he burns much of the city, what was left. A lot of it had already been burned by the Confederates, but he burns a lot of the rest of it, and about 40% of the city is destroyed. And Sherman, to this day, is vilified by some people for that. Hood protested. Hood was, of course, marching toward Tennessee. He found out about this, and he protested, and Sherman replied, if the people raise a howl against my barbarity and cruelty, I will answer that war is war and not popularity seeking. If they want peace, they and their relatives must stop the war. And the mayor of Atlanta also protested, and Sherman told him, war is cruelty and you cannot refine it. That's a famous quote. In another letter, he makes the famous statement, war is hell. So Sherman's basically saying, if you don't want me to burn things and destroy things, then surrender. Stop. You guys started this. I'm trying to bring it to a conclusion. So Sherman is totally not apologetic. He says war, and he's one of the first to grasp the concept of total war, that war is not just something that two professional armies go fight and nobody else notices what's going on. War has got to affect the entire population. All right, let me move on just a little, and then we'll talk about it. Let's see. On November 16th, Sherman's army steps off. They leave Atlanta. They march westward toward the Atlantic coast. His orders were to forage for food and not to destroy civilian property. Although, I must say, in all fairness, this was not often obeyed, and Sherman didn't always try real hard to enforce that. There was a lot of looting and theft and destruction of civilian property, despite the fact that that wasn't supposed to happen. The army also destroyed much, but not all of what they encountered. There's a common myth that Sherman's army destroyed everything in its path, like a band of locusts in the Old Testament or something. That's not true. They didn't destroy everything, but they did destroy a lot. Sherman himself estimated that he did $100 million in damage. $100 million, it would be a lot today, but when you can consider it, that's like today, like $1 back then is like 15 today, so that would be like 1.5 billion, I guess, if my math is correct. So anyway, yeah, it was very, very destructive.
Yeah, and I'd like to look at some of his field orders on how do you handle this foraging, because this is a question here. Did he advocate total destruction? This is something that you see in the myth of the lost cause, the Southern narrative of the Civil War, the school of thought that emerges in the decades after the Civil War by Southern historians, that what Sherman does today, you could compare it to a Red Army marching through Eastern Europe and going to Germany, where the Red Army essentially rapes almost every woman they come across and shoots men or sends them to the gulag. Or is it something like the Mongols or in medieval warfare, where when an army successfully breaks a siege, the soldiers are essentially given 3 days to ransack and pillage, to enslave people they come across, to loot and steal, because this forms the backbone of a lot of payment you would give to a soldier in the Middle Ages. Is that what's happening here, or is it more of a coordinated plan strategy? And I want to read these field orders just to see what Sherman is thinking. And like James mentioned, these orders don't convey the full reality of what's happening, because there are many soldiers who simply ignore the orders and go for a free-for-all. So you could take it that way. But here are just a few of his orders. One of them, the army will forage liberally on the country during the march. To this end, each brigade commander will organize a good and sufficient foraging party under the command of one or more discreet officers who will gather, near the route traveled, corn or forage of any kind, meat of any kind, vegetables, cornmeal, or whatever is needed by the command, aiming at all times to keep in the wagons at least 10 days' provisions for the command and 3 days' forage. Soldiers must not enter the dwellings of the inhabitants or commit any trespass, but during a halt or a camp, they may be permitted to gather turnips, apples, and other vegetables, and to drive in stock to their camp, and to drive in stock of their camp. To regular foraging parties must be instructed the gathering of provisions and forage at any distance from the road traveled. So don't break into people's homes, he's saying, but you can kind of have a free-for-all on farms. Other factors, too, to Army commanders. To Army Corps commanders alone is entrusted the power to destroy mills, houses, cotton gins, and for them, this general principle is laid down. In districts and neighborhoods where the Army is unmolested, no destruction of such property should be permitted. But should guerrillas or bushwhackers molest our march, or should the inhabitants burn bridges, obstruct roads, or otherwise manifest local hostility, then Army commanders should order and enforce a devastation more or less relentless according to the measure of such hostility. So you get wiggle room if you get hostility from the locals, and I'm sure there were commanders who they got an inch and they took a mile.
Yeah, I think that was interpreted pretty loosely in some cases. Hostility from the locals could be like if you said, hey, don't take my farm. Oh, look, there's hostility, so we're going to burn it.
Right. Or they look at you skunk-eyed and you're going to pillage their house and go for it. And then one other thing here, I thought this is an interesting order, and I'll just mention, where they try to discriminate between the rich and the poor Southerners they encounter. As for horses, mules, wagons, etc., belonging to the inhabitants, the cavalry and artillery may appropriate freely and without limit, discriminating, however, between the rich, who are usually hostile, and the poor or industrious, usually neutral or friendly. Foraging parties may also take mules or horses to replace the jaded animals of their trains, or to serve as pack mules for the regiments or brigades. In all foraging, of whatever kind, the parties engaged will refrain from abusive or threatening language, and may, where the officer in command thinks proper, give written certificates of the facts, but no receipts, and they will endeavor to leave with each family a reasonable portion for their maintenance. Yeah, I'm sure that's really kept
reasonable portion.
Yeah, so there's a lot of wiggle room. So I guess Sherman is trying to make this as orderly as possible and not have it be a Mongolian-style pillage of the land where everyone gets whatever they can lay their hands on. But there's sufficient discretion that if a commander wants to, he can really go to town. So that's the parameters that we're seeing here.
Yeah, a lot of soldiers wrote home that they were eating the best they'd ever eaten in their lives. I mean, you think about Army rations, they're famous for being terrible, and the Civil War is no exception. They would have, oftentimes, when they had meat, it would be stale, sometimes even rotten. It would just be not very good, rancid in some cases. The vegetables were in short supply always. A lot of what they ate was called hardtack, which was a really thick cracker, very, very hard, hence the name hardtack. I've actually had some before. It's like eating a brick, a small brick. But now, I mean, think about it. They're having beef, they're having bacon, they're having chicken, they're having vegetables, just whatever they can get, milk and butter and cheese. And there's there's a party style atmosphere. It's like this one long party. And I'm sure there was plenty of alcohol to be found along the way, too.
Oh, yes. The hard cider makes its appearance.
All right. Shall we continue the march?
Let's.
All right. So they're marching along, and eventually they reach Milledgeville, which at the time was the capital of Georgia. It was not Atlanta at this time. And they go into part of Sherman's army, some of his soldiers, they go into the state capitol, and they held a mock legislative session. And during this session, they formally repealed the Ordinance of Secession. So that's kind of funny. They officially bring Georgia back to the Union. Of course, that doesn't have any authority, but it's fun for the guys. And as I mentioned, along the way, they meet with very little resistance. And finally, on December 21st, they enter the city of Savannah on the coast. And Sherman wires Lincoln, and he makes the famous statement, another one of these great Shermanisms. He says, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with guns and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." And Lincoln said, "This is one of the best Christmas presents I've ever received." So the Army had marched 250 miles. They picked up several thousand former slaves. And as we mentioned, they'd done $100 million approximately worth of damage in the money of the time, which is an incredible amount of damage. One Union soldier wrote home and he said, "We had a gay old campaign. We destroyed all we couldn't eat. We stole all their Negroes, burned their cotton and gins, spilled their sorghum, burned and twisted their railroads, and raised hell generally." That's a great quote. Dr. Gary Gallagher quotes that in all of his lectures on this, and it's just really sums up what happened. They're having fun, and it's, you think about it, they're almost never being shot at, so that's kind of a nice perk as well. Now, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of runaway slaves had attached themselves to Sherman's army, and he wasn't real wild about this. He didn't really know what to do with them. Sherman actually met with some black leaders to seek their advice on what to do with the former slaves who had joined the army, or at least unofficially joined it. And they told Sherman that owning their own land was the best way for them to be truly free. So Sherman does something really radical, really not in his character. I mentioned earlier how he was not an abolitionist, didn't want to see the widespread end of slavery necessarily, but despite that, he issues Field Order 15, and this confiscates 400,000 acres of land, and he divides it into 40-acre plots and gives each plot to a black family. This is where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was wondering.
Very famous phrase from the Reconstruction era. Yeah, 40 acres was kind of like the minimum amount of land you could have to have a viable farm. At least it was considered to be the case. This order later is going to be rescinded by President Andrew Johnson, but for a while at least, things are looking good for these former slaves. They actually get some land, and they're able to raise crops. But sadly, that's going to come to an end within just a couple of years. All
right. Well, his march is not over, so...
Oh, no, he's just getting started.
Tell me about the next march.
All right. So one interesting thing that happens is that some congressman, I forget who it was, but that he introduces a bill to make Sherman the same rank as Grant. There's a lot of people who are still anti-Grant. We've talked about how there were some politicians and other Northern leaders who didn't like Grant and tried to get him drummed out of the service, and Lincoln repeatedly said, "Hey, I can't let this guy go. He fights. This is a guy that fights." There was a famous quote where somebody complained about somebody complained about Grant's drinking, and Lincoln supposedly said, "Well, I'd like to find out what brand of whiskey he drinks so I can send it to all of my generals."
Yeah, his drinking liability was now seen as an asset.
Yeah, and of course that was way overblown anyway. But Sherman is very loyal to Grant. He's friends with Grant, and Sherman refuses it. He says, "I don't want the promotion. Grant deserves to be the number one general. He deserves to be the only lieutenant general in the entire army." So this is one of the few times in history that a military officer is offered a promotion and turns it down. Not the only time, but it's certainly notable because it's so rare. All right, the next few weeks, Sherman rests his army around Savannah. The army gets reinforcements, and it grows to 100,000. And the people of South Carolina begin to shake in their boots because South Carolina, as we all know, is just north of Georgia. They're next. In late January, Sherman kicks off and marches through South Carolina. And this is beginning to be a little personal. In Georgia, to quote one of the mafia guys, I think that was this Marlon Brando in The Godfather, "It's not business, it's personal." No, it's the other way around. I'm sorry, it's not personal, it's business.
It's personal, it's business.
Yeah, leave it to me to blow the quote. I'm not big on mafia movies, but so in Georgia, it wasn't personal, it was business. But now in South Carolina, it is personal because, as we all know, South Carolina was the hotbed of rebellion. This is where secession began. They were the first state to go out of the Union. One officer actually wrote in a letter, "Here is where treason began, and by God, here is where it will end." So if Georgia had it tough, South Carolina is going to have it even tougher. Now, one thing that works against Sherman on this march is that the weather was awful. It rains just about every other day on average. But Sherman says, "Okay, fine. If we don't have roads, we're going to make roads." So the army cuts down trees and they make corduroy roads,